In 2007, Canada convicted its youngest person for a triple homicide. She had just turned 13 years old. Hey, hi, and hello. Chris here. Welcome back to my true crime channel. So a little while ago, I covered a story about Canada's youngest serial killer, Cody Lejabikoff. And if you haven't watched it already, I'll post a link in the description box below so you could check it out later if you want. But today, we're going to discuss the case of Canada's youngest convicted female, who was just a 12-year-old girl when she was charged with 3 first-degree murders. This case was recommended in my comment section, so a huge thank you to ABF. Now, I have to put out a little disclaimer out there because we're talking about someone who was a minor at the time and in Canada. So in this case, I'm only going to be referring to her as JR. I am Canadian, and here the girl's identity is actually protected by the Canada's Youth Criminal Justice Act. So unfortunately, while I will post some pics, her face is going to be blurred out. But with that being said, all you have to do is a quick Google search and you can find all the information that you want. I'm just not going to be the naughty one today. This one may be a tad long because I wanted to make sure that I could put in as much information as I could. And with that being said, I still cut a lot out. So grab a coffee, an adult bevy or drink of your choice, and let's get into it. So this case happened in Medicine Hat, Alberta, and it's a small town with a population of less than 100,000 people. It's one of those communities that is quiet and it is known to be relatively safe. It was early afternoon on April 26, 2006, when a neighborhood boy about 6 years old went over to his best friend's place next door to see if he could play. Now this little boy ran home immediately and said to his mom, "Mommy, there's bodies over there with blood on them." When asked, the little boy said that he peeked through the basement window and that's when he saw them. So the mother headed over there, not knowing if her son was lying or just trying to joke around. Unfortunately, he was telling the truth. And when the police got there, they found the bodies of the mother, the father, and one of the children, an 8-year-old little boy. When the responding officers first arrived, they really didn't know what they were dealing with. Was it a murder-suicide? Was the killer still in the house? They didn't know. So with that, they called for more backup before entering the house. When they finally entered the house at 1:45 p.m., they were immediately shocked when they saw all the blood. There were smears on the staircases, the walls, and the kitchen door handles. They headed downstairs and at the bottom of the basement, and that's when they found the first body, the mother. Laying next to her, wearing only a pair of boxers, was her husband. His body was covered in blood. There were punctures, cuts, and slices all over his face and body. Next to him lay a screwdriver and a black-handled knife. With their guns drawn, 2 of the officers followed a trail of blood that led upstairs to where the bedrooms were. And walking down the hallway, they looked into what appeared to be a girl's room. And it was cluttered, a little messy, but there was definitely no signs of a struggle or violence, so they continued on down the hallway. What they found next will haunt the officers to this day. It was the little boy's room. The boy was laying on his bed in just a pair of underwear, and it was evident he was not alive. Blood was everywhere, on the floor, the walls, and his toys. It really did look like a scene from a horror movie. His eyes were wide open and his neck had a huge gash in it. Now, after ensuring that the house was clear and that there were no other people there, one of the officers was looking around and saw a picture, and it was sitting on the coffee table. And it was a picture of a mother, a father, the daughter, and the son. So there were 3 people in the house. Where was the daughter? Had the perps abducted her? And the investigation and the questioning of the neighbors immediately began. And many of the neighbors were in such shock that this happened in their nice, quiet community. And when confirmed that the girl in the picture was indeed the daughter, no one had any idea where she might be. Now, thinking that the officers might have missed something, they actually went in and did a second search of the house, a very thorough search. We searched high and low, underneath beds, looking for where a kid would hide. To no avail. And at this point, they were very concerned that she may have been abducted. Where was JR? Now let's take a moment to look back at the family. Now, the parents had been married for 15 years, and while their past was a little rough, they got it together. They had 2 great kids and now owned their own home in a nice, quiet community. Dad worked in the oil and gas industry, and Mom was just about to start her little home-based business, and she was into the new age in Reiki, I think you pronounce it, and she was going to start a business based on that. And the family looked really good, and it looked really like a typical family would. Weekend barbecues, family trips. It seemed like a good old Canadian family. And I mentioned earlier that in the past, it was a little rough for them. Well, both of the parents had a substance abuse problem, but by the time they got together, they were in recovery, and they vowed to each other that they would work hard, stay clean, and change their lives. And that they did. On October of 1993, Mom gave birth to her first child, a baby girl we're calling JR. 3 years later, they had a second child, a little baby boy. And on all accounts, it looked like a very healthy, happy family. And JR loved her little brother and would play with him all the time. And during the early years, there were some financial struggles, but like I said, Mom and Dad, they were so determined that they were just going to work hard and make things work, and they did. And after a lot of hard work and dedication, the father had a very good job, and like I said, they owned their own home. The young boy, he was happy, he was energetic, and he loved playing ball hockey. He also had a passion for Star Wars, and he would often grab his lightsaber and reenact the heroes of the movie. The daughter JR was, by all accounts, a typical preteen. Her room was full of stuffed animals. She loved to read, so books were everywhere. And she also attended a Catholic school, and she was considered to be polite, quiet, and a good student. She was very well liked and could easily make new friends. Her and her friends would often go swimming, to the mall, to the movies, just typical everyday stuff. And following in her mother's footsteps, JR would also become interested in the New Age, with the emphasis being in Wicca. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that, but so much so that she even made a pentagram out of black tape on her bedroom wall. It was in 6th grade when JR and her friends actually started questioning the formal religion that was taught in her Catholic school. They just couldn't get behind it. JR and a few of her friends were becoming very drawn to the local goth crowd. It was a small group. They usually hung around at the mall, but JR was fascinated about how they were all dressed in black and how they all wore this dark makeup with pale skin. And it wasn't long before she started diving deeper and deeper into that world, wearing the same kind of clothes and doing her makeup the same way. And once again, nothing wrong with goth. There are a few pictures of JR floating around the internet, all in black and acting very seductively. Totally inappropriate for a girl that age. It was very clear that she was maturing way faster than her friends. And even at the age of 11, she could easily pass for a 16-year-old. Just short of age 12, she joined a website called MindViz. And it's, a typical social media site where you can have friends and you can message back and forth and in groups and stuff like that. But it was on her personal profile that she listed herself as bisexual and single. She did not list her age, but with the pictures that she did upload to that site, well, let's just say she did not look 12 at all. She also used another website called MySpace. I'm sure a lot of us can remember that little stint in life. Anyway, on this profile, she actually did have her age listed, but she made herself older than what she actually was. And also, she had criminal psychology, blood, serial killers, and kinky shit as her interests. She listed Jeffrey Dahmer as one of her heroes. I mean, we need to find better heroes, people. It's the fall of 2005, and JR actually heads back to school after being on summer vacation. Immediately, the school counselor was concerned. JR was always quiet, sweet, studious. But coming into this new school year, oh no. We can see a huge change and quite the difference in her. JR was wearing very short skirts, fishnet stockings, spike collars around her neck, chains. You get the idea. Now remember, JR attended a Catholic school, so this was in clear violation of the school's dress code, and many conversations were had with her. Now the school, they really wanted to have conversations and being encouraging to the students instead of just expelling them. In November of 2005, JR signed on to another website. This one was called vampirefreaks.com. And even though she was still just 12 years old, she listed her age as 15, and she called herself X-Killer Kitty X. Once again, she posted very seductive pictures of herself. JR began dating a 16-year-old boy, and when Mom found out, she insisted on meeting him. It seemed innocent enough. They were both basically just kind of hanging around with friends at the mall and such, so Mom really wasn't too concerned. JR evidently really enjoyed the online life, and she started another account on Nexopia. This was another social networking site here in Canada. And on this site, among other things, she listed one of her interests as killing livestock. On her wish list, she had piercings on every part of her body that you could imagine and tattoos. Now, there's nothing wrong with body piercings and tattoos, but remember, she is just 12 years old. Now we're going to head over to the other side of town where we're going to talk about Jeremy. Jeremy was 23 years old, and he was a high school dropout who was living with his mom in a trailer park. This man fantasized about this other world, and he even considered himself to be a werewolf. And more than likely, he created this alter ego because he was really, and I mean extremely bullied in school, and his mother was abused by the alcoholic father and 2 stepdads. Jeremy himself was also abused, pretty much on a daily basis by his birth father, and sadly it did not end there. When his mother finally divorced and got remarried, the stepdad also dished out an incredible amount of both physical and verbal abuse towards Jeremy. It was in his teens, and it was around 14 years old when he turned to alcohol and pot. There was a suicide attempt, and on a few occasions he drank so much he ended up passing out. Jeremy also became a cutter. And I'm not going to get into the psychology of this, but you can clearly see that this young man was having serious issues and serious troubles. In grade 10, Jeremy dropped out of school. He said that he just couldn't take it anymore, and he was using the excuse that his mother had fallen very ill. He stayed with her for a little while, and then for a brief time, Jeremy later moved in with his biological father in Saskatchewan. But it didn't last long, and he ended up moving back to Medicine Hat. He was living with friends and working minimum wage jobs here and there. But we all know minimum wage jobs just don't pay the bills. So he ended up moving back into his mom's place, who was deep into her alcohol addiction. Jeremy's mother was charged with stabbing her boyfriend in 2005, and fortunately for the boyfriend, he didn't die. And she was only sentenced to 12 months probation, but she continued to breach it because she didn't stay away from him. But Jeremy had to see all this and had to deal with all this. Now, Jeremy's relationships with women were also a disaster. He liked to date younger girls, and it seemed like the older he got, the younger he liked to date. In this small town, Jeremy was very well known with the police. His crimes were small and never amounted to any jail time. He was caught shoplifting, causing a disturbance, and even once he was caught bouncing a check. In the summer of 2005, Jeremy would also enter the world of goth. It was here where he finally gained acceptance. And even though he had an intense, fierce look, the others in the group would describe him as caring, fun, and polite. Hanging out at the mall one day, like most teens do, JR was with her friend when they ran into Jeremy. The girl introduced Jeremy to her friends and to JR. It was December of 2005 when they all started hanging out. He was 23 and she was only 12 years old. Freaking disgusting. But they bonded because they were both having problems with their family. JR had ongoing arguments with her parents about how she dressed and the fact that she was hanging around older people and especially the older guys. Her parents were not having it. So JR devised ways in order to deceive her parents into who she was with and what she was doing. I mean, most teens, this seems like a natural skill that they have, ways to get around parents' rules. One point, JR even went to her school counselor and complained about her parents. She wanted to be out of the house. And now, concerned that there was something possibly abusive happening, the counselor questioned and probed her more. JR stated that there were just too many rules. She didn't like the curfews and the chores, and it was unreasonable. She kept saying, "I hate it there, I hate it there." Oh my gosh, she was like 12 years old. Of course there's going to be curfews and rules and such. Anyway, the counselor was pretty confident that there was no abuse happening at the home and it was just some disgruntled teen, so he did not call it in at all. There was no concern in his mind. And it was February when JR and Jeremy had their first official date. They were heading to an all-age punk show at the community hall, and it was there that they decided to make it official and be a couple. Now, he thought she was 15, but even at that young, him being 23, it didn't bother him at all. Knowing that her parents would disapprove for obvious reasons, she kept her relationship and Jeremy a complete secret. She would quietly talk to him on the phone, message him through the social media sites, and would sneak him over to her place when, the parents weren't home. Things blew up at home one day when JR was left home to babysit her little brother. JR left her little brother alone while she took off to go hang out with friends. When the parents found out about this, they were furious. They grounded her, and to JR, that was the breaking point. As time went by, and even though she was grounded and couldn't go out on weekends, through the direct messaging and everything else, JR and Jeremy ended up becoming closer and closer, to the point where they declared their love for one another. Now at this time, Jeremy was out and about doing his thing and still claiming to be this 300-year-old werewolf. And at one point, he even told a new friend not to come for a walk with him as he may eat him. Now, JR's parents were growing more and more concerned about their daughter. So much so that even at one point, Dad took her computer to the local computer store and asked the tech that if he could hack into her social media accounts. Dad wanted to see what she was doing on there. He wanted to see the messages. But to no avail, the tech said that he could not do that. So without being able to see what was going on and with no other options, the parents just decided to completely take away the computer. But this did not stop JR. Oh no. She would go and use the public library computers as well as the computers that were located in the school. Nothing was going to stop her from continuing to talk to Jeremy. This toxic relationship continued to grow, and she continued to deceive her parents so she could see him and message him. On March 16th, 2006, Jeremy wrote JR a direct message. How goes it? You are a sight for sore eyes, and I miss you more than killing people. Can we get together and kill people together? I have a poem for you, and you shall see it when I see you. Tee-hee. Well, I guess I should go. I love you tons. Now, JR responded to this message by saying, killing people sounded like fun. Now, they continue to chat, discussing like a goth wedding, moving to Europe and living in like some great big castle. But even more disturbing, they would talk about killing people. When are we going to get together and kill some more pitiful souls? Jeremy once wrote. In one message to another friend, Jeremy wrote that him and JR were actually fantasizing about killing her parents and brother. They wanted to mimic a scene in his all-time favorite movie, Natural Born Killers. Now, JR's parents were still trying their very best to try to help her. She was on a very dark path, and even with the grounding and taking away the computer, there were still ongoing issues with her school and her attitude. So they decided to start going to therapy. And to their surprise, JR actually agreed to go to therapy with them without much arguments. Was this JR's way to manipulate her parents? Maybe, because after several sessions and continued improvement in her attitude, her parents let up a bit and allowed JR to go to one of the punk shows that she loved so much. But there was one condition: they were to go with her. Embarrassed and not happy about this arrangement, JR still decided to go because she wanted to see Jeremy and they could arrange it if they were there. While hanging out with her friends at the show, they decided to sneak out. Jeremy was outside waiting for her. Her friends went for a walk to let the couple have some privacy. They embraced, they hugged, and started kissing. It didn't take long for JR's parents to notice that she wasn't inside at the concert, and they had actually come outside to look for her. They came upon the two of them, and her parents were furious. Their young daughter was making out with a much older man. What the hell? Jeremy saw the parents and took off in the opposite direction. There was so much tension that night you could cut it with a knife. And if you thought her parents were upset before, this took things to a whole new level. She was grounded for 1 month. No phone, no computer, no music, no makeup, nothing. She was to go directly to school and come home directly afterwards. No library, no nothing. JR said she felt like she was a prisoner in her own home. Well, yeah, no kidding. After countless hours of begging and pleading, JR's parents gave in and allowed her access to the computer once again. But only if she removed all the older guys from her social media sites. Her parents were now monitoring all her online activity, and JR was actually getting more and more upset. She wasn't getting her way, she didn't get the privacy that she wanted, and she hated every minute of it. In the end of March, JR wrote a message to Jeremy. Rawr, I hate them. So I have this plan. It begins with me killing them, and it ends with me living with you. So we are set. I'm going to try and call you, but I really don't know if I'll be able to. They are treating me like shit. I hate them so much. But I hope this won't bring us far apart. I hope to talk to you soon, and I love you with all my heart. The very next day, Jeremy wrote back saying he loved the plan, but they needed to get creative with the details. He also posted a poem on Nexopia about JR's family with the following lines. It's all total bullshit. Their throats I want to slit. They will regret the shit they have done, especially when I see to it that they are gone. They shall pay for their insolence. Finally, there will be silence. Their blood shall be payment. Now, JR had snuck out of the house a few times throughout her grounding, through the basement windows and such like that, in order to see Jeremy in the middle of the night. Nothing could get between these two. And during these rendezvous, they would continue to plot and plan the killing of her parents. They even agreed that it was unfair to leave her little brother in this world without the parents, so he would have to die as well. They talked about various ways of doing it: shooting, house fires, stabbing. There was a debate on who thought of the idea of murder for the first time, but according to an email that was found during the investigation, it was JR who came up with the idea first. And it was stated later that many of the friends overheard conversations on how JR was begging and pleading for Jeremy to kill her parents. Why did nobody say anything? Now let's fast forward a few months. It's Sunday, April 23rd, 2006, and after a night of partying, getting high and drinking, Jeremy drove towards JR's house. When he got there, he picked up a pine cone from the front lawn and tossed it up to JR's window. JR opened the window and motioned him to go down to the basement window. The mother, hearing a noise and thinking that JR was actually trying to sneak out again, got up from her warm bed and headed down into the basement. She didn't see JR, but unfortunately ran into the man, dressed all in black and wearing a black face mask. Now Jeremy, he was high as a kite. He came at her with a knife. The mother screamed and held up her arms in a defensive position, leaving her stomach exposed. Jeremy saw the opportunity and took a jab, and not just once. She ended up having 12 stab wounds in her body. Now hearing the scream, the father jumped from the bed and ran down into the basement. He saw his wife on the floor and a man above her. He picked up a screwdriver that was on the basement floor, and for a few minutes the two of them just stood there staring at each other. Now, according to Jeremy's statement later on, he said that the father came at him. There was a struggle, and Jeremy, who was now scared shitless, those were his words, began slashing every which way he could. He stated that he lost control and he doesn't know how many times he had stabbed the father. It was later revealed that he had been stabbed 24 times. As JR's father laid there dying, he whispered, "Why?" Quote, "'Cause you treat your daughter like shit. It's what your daughter wanted." End quote. Now, could you imagine hearing those words as you are struggling to take in your last breath? Meeting JR upstairs in the kitchen, Jeremy was covered in blood. She gave him a kiss and told him how much she loved him. She left him standing there as she headed upstairs to where the bedrooms were. Now, JR went into her little brother's room and tried to strangle him. He got loose and tried to take off down the hallway. But by this time, Jeremy had come upstairs and saw the little boy. He said, "We can't just leave him." It was stated later, after the investigation, that it looked like the little boy tried to fight so hard for his life. But in the end, it was a knife wound to the neck that got him. We don't know who, at the end of it, killed the little boy, as they both blamed each other. JR cleaned off the knife and told Jeremy to give her a few minutes. She needed to get some things. She started gathering some clothes and some personal items, as well as her mom's purse and her mom's wallet. And maybe he was coming off as high. Maybe it was the realization of what he just did. But Jeremy was freaking out. He ended up throwing up and he was starting to really panic. He didn't want to wait for JR. He got into his truck and took off without her. Now, JR didn't know where he went, and she couldn't get a hold of him. She tried multiple times to try to phone his place. There was no answer. So she ended up just getting a taxi and headed off to another friend's place. When she got there, a little bit more composed Jeremy was waiting for her. While the next day, while the two were hanging out with friends, drinking and eating burgers, the detectives would be discovering the 3 murdered bodies. I also want to add that at this point, Jeremy confided in one of his good friends and told him what the two of them had done. Once again, nobody said anything. Meanwhile, the police continued their investigation. They gathered forensic evidence, they talked to people, and they even went to JR's school. The police had already released her photo as a possible missing person and wanted the public's help to find her. And like I said at the beginning of this case, the law here in Canada prohibits the publication of the names of any minor offenders as well as any family members that could be used to identify them. But because this was first known as just a missing person, her name and photos were released to the media. Anyway, there was a ton of evidence that was being gathered, including a hand-drawn picture found in JR's school locker. It depicted her family dying. And now the police realized that she wasn't just missing, she was the main suspect. After seeing the pictures of these two all over the news, a few of their friends, now despite not wanting to, actually did the right thing and went down to the station and gave statements. JR and Jeremy were starting to get really nervous as reports of the crime was all over the news. A few of their friends were also getting a bit edgy because they had known about this. They had heard about them talking about it. So they got into a friend's truck, and with JR and Jeremy keeping down so nobody could see them, they decided to head out of town. They left Medicine Hat around 8:30 p.m. There were 4 of them in the front of the truck, and JR and Jeremy were actually hiding in the truck bed that had a canopy on it. They were going to be heading towards Saskatchewan. Leader, Saskatchewan. And yes, that's actually the name of the place. It's a very, very small farming town with a population of maybe 1,000 people. The rookie constable that was on duty received a BOL for suspects wanted in a triple homicide. And it was later learned that some of their friends told officers during all the questioning that they were headed that way. The rookie, thinking that the group was going to need to stop for gas, headed over to the Esso station. He parked at the corner and waited. His hunch was right because around 7 a.m. a small pickup matching this description pulled in. As the 3 girls headed in to use the bathroom, JR and Jeremy stayed curled up under the blankets in the truck. They were all fueled up. The group took off from the gas station, and meanwhile, the officer was keeping an eye and following them at a distance. They stopped at a nearby school parking lot, and that is when the constable called in for backup. Guns drawn, they approached the truck. The entire group was handcuffed and brought back to the station. Less than 30 hours after the brutal murders, JR and Jeremy were brought back to Medicine Hat. They were in custody and each would be charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. At just 12 and a half years old, JR would become the youngest person in Canada to be charged with a multiple homicide. More than a year went by, and after hours and hours of interrogations, days and days of going back and forth, he said, she said, days and days of investigation, the trials would begin on June 4th, 2007. They would be tried separately. On July 9th, 2007, JR, who was now 13 years old, was found guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. On November 8th, 2007, she was sentenced to maximum penalty of 10 years imprisonment. Because she had already spent 18 months in custody, this would be included in her sentencing. She would have to spend 4 years in a psychiatric institution and 4.5 years under conditional supervision in the community. In May 2016, after a final sentence review, her sentence was completed, and she was free of any further court-ordered conditions, restrictions, or supervision. Now, Jeremy admitted to the murder of the parents when he was in custody. He was telling it all to an undercover cop. He was tried in November 2008 and was found guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder. On December 15th, 2008, Jeremy was sentenced to 3 life sentences, 1 for each first-degree murder. The sentences are to be served concurrently, and Jeremy will be eligible for parole after only serving 25 years. He possibly could be out by 2033. Don't you just love the Canadian justice system? And that's it for today's case. a child who murders 300-year-old werewolves. This one was a lot. But I thank you so much for sticking around and watching. Please be well and stay safe. Until next time.